Once upon a time in America, before there was an internet, before we had broadband bundles, before we had smartphones, there were telephone monopolies, and the only infrastructure built to handle voice was the telephone companies. And as a result, to encourage competition in what was then a natural monopoly, federal regulators required that the telephone monopolies make their facilities available to those who would want to sell similar services in competition. Well, that probably made sense in the 60s and the 70s. However, where we find ourselves today, of course, is post-broadband revolution, where you have bundles, you have cross-platform competition, you have wireless and wired telephone companies and cable companies all providing similar bundles. When the 1996 Telecom Reform Act happened in Congress, they said, we'd like to encourage investment and we want to encourage cross-platform competition. And so the cable companies did not face regulation, and the telephone companies were told, you have to continue sharing your platforms. What we saw was that there was massive investment by the cable companies, and the cable companies leapt to the lead in internet access and subsequently in broadband investment and in broadband service providing to consumers. Around 2002, the FCC decided, we need more competition against the cable companies. And it's clear that the telephone companies aren't investing in as much fiber as we'd like because they face all of these legacy regulations from back when they were a monopoly, which they no longer are. So let's come up with a policy that we'll colloquially call new wires, new rules. And what that says is the old copper infrastructure that was built in a monopoly era, that was required to be shared at regulated rates, would continue exactly as it was. But for new fiber platforms, there would be freedom from those legacy regulations. Not surprisingly, there was overwhelming investment in fiber, and we saw a broadband infrastructure explosion with the telcos starting to compete with cable, who was unregulated, and also competing with wireless, who is unregulated. As a result, we had a terrific explosion in bandwidth and growing competition for consumers. What we find now is that as the copper platforms and the copper infrastructure, which is no longer as relevant to businesses and consumers as it used to be, is going the way of the dodo and being retired, we're finding that the competitors from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, whose business models were to piggyback on infrastructure built by others, have gone to the FCC and said, we'd like requirements that the new wires now face old rules, the exact opposite of what the FCC proposed about a decade ago.